Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture, we're going to be looking at the Lindahl Equilibrium. And this is from my public finance course in the section on public choice. So when we take a look at the Lindahl Equilibrium, the thing that you need to understand about this is that when we aggregate the demand curve for public goods, this aggregation is very different from private goods. With private goods, we horizontally sum. That is, at given prices, we add the quantities to get the market demand. For public goods, we have to sum vertically. So we pick a government level of public goods, or the level of public goods or government expenditures, and we sum the prices upward. So for private goods, it's a horizontal summation, and for public goods, it's a vertical summation. So to keep this easy, we'll just take a look at two individual demand curves here, individual one's demand curve and individual two's demand curve, and that represents the tax price of those public goods versus the level of government expenditures. So since we're going to be adding this vertically instead of horizontally, and I suggest if you're a little rusty on how to sum a market demand curve, for a private good, you can go to my YouTube page and there are videos related to how to do that. So if we take a look, for levels of government expenditures between G1 and G2, the only operational demand curve is individual two's demand curve. Individual one is not interested in government expenditures beyond G1. So the collective demand curve for this public good is going to be equal to individual two's demand curve for the level of government expenditures between G1 and G2. So it's represented by that hash marked line and indicating it's identical to the individual two's demand curve. For levels of government expenditures from 0 to G1, we sum vertically at the quantities, adding up the tax prices for each one, for each individual. And the easiest way to do that is just to go where government expenditures are equal to 0, and you add the tax price 1 for individual 1 and tax price 2 for individual 2. Add those two together, and that will give us where the collective demand curve for these public goods will intersect the tax price axis. So if we do that, that's tax price 1 and tax price 2 added together. So this dotted line gives us the collective demand curve. So realize that for government expenditures from 0 to G1, we're vertically adding individual 1's demand curve to individual 2's demand curve. All right? For government expenditures from G1 to G2, the only one that matters is individual two's demand curve, because they're the only individual out of these two individuals who wish government expenditures to be above G1. So the collective demand curve is equivalent to individual two's demand curve for government expenditures greater than G1. So let's take a look and use this collective demand curve to see what the efficient level of consumption of public goods, i.e. the amount of government expenditures. It's where the supply curve, or the marginal cost curve, is equal to the collective demand curve, which is also the marginal benefit curve. So where the supply curve and the demand curve for public goods, i.e. government expenditures, are equivalent to one another, that is going to be the equilibrium amount of government expenditures indicated by G star, and the price associated with that is the tax price 1 plus the tax price 2 for these two individuals. If we bring that G1 back and use it with the individual demand curves, if we go from G star up to individual two's demand curve and across, that gives us the price that they are willing to pay for those, the tax price they're willing to pay for that level of government expenditures. And if we continue upward to individual one's demand curve, that gives us the tax price that individual one is willing to pay. Now, I rarely quote from a textbook when I do these types of lectures, but I think this quote from the textbook we're using for this course is the best way to put this. The Lindahl equilibrium is thus a set of tax prices, the amount each individual has to pay if one more unit of public goods is produced, adding up to the marginal cost of production, such that given those tax prices, every individual prefers the same level expenditures, G star. Because at the Lindahl equilibrium, the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost. The Lindahl equilibrium is Pareto efficient. So hopefully that'll be a little bit of help to you understanding, number one, how we go from individual demand curves for public goods to the collective demand curve for that that particular public good or a level of public goods. How we determine what the equilibrium amount is from that using the collective demand curve and the supply curve for those government expenditures and those public goods that are being produced. So that gives us the equilibrium level of government expenditures, and then using that equilibrium government level of government expenditures, going back to the individual demand curve to see the tax price that each person is willing to pay at that level of equilibrium government expenditures.